In this video, we are going to tackle which brushes, paints, and paper are best, and if you're just starting out, where you should really invest your budget. This is a showdown between student level and professional, and I will put each of these three categories through my own test, and hopefully this will help you make some decisions on your end. Let's get started. Okay, so we will start with paper. I have two brands here. This is Faber-Castell, and it will say along the bottom usually what it's made from. This is 50% recycled materials. I'm not sure what exactly that means. And then the Canson, which I know is a popular brand for a lot of painters. This is also not 100% cotton paper. And you will notice that there's a bit of a difference between these papers. That Faber-Castell one is quite thin, and the Canson brand one is a bit thicker. You can kind of see the difference between the two, hopefully the side view. Okay, so those are the two student grade papers that I have, and for professional level papers I have two here. This is Winsor & Newton 100% cotton, 140 pound cold press. This is a really high quality paper and I love working with it. And then really popular also are the Arches brand, and they also come in 100% cotton, and they have different versions of each of these brands as well. You can get cold press, hot press, rough, it really depends, but the important part is that it's 100% cotton, and each of these sheets is quite thick. You can see that this paper is also quite thick and just pretty sturdy, so it can take quite a bit of paint and water. Okay, and the Winsor & Newton paper is actually in a block format. You can get paper like this that's sealed on the sides. This just helps your paper lay flat when you're working, so you can use a lot of water and you don't have to worry about the paper warping. I have a letter opener, and what you do is when you're done and your painting is dry, you stick that in at the top, and then you can unseal your paper and remove it from the rest of the block. So this is just a little example. This is what it looks like, and it's also a quite thick paper, so you can see that it's quite sturdy too. And it's a really good, nice quality paper. So I won't unseal the whole thing, but I just wanted to show you the edging of what that looks like. If you don't have a block style of paper like this, you can still use loose sheets of paper and tape down your edges, and that will also keep your paper nice and flat. So for today's little experiment, I'm going to be testing out all four of these papers with both professional level paints, student grade paints, and professional high quality brushes and standard student brush as well. This is literally a student grade paint and brush. This is from my son's class, and they used it in the classroom, and I did do a little experiment with this, and it comes with that little cover which I use as a mixing tray. There aren't really any markings on it as far as pigment. It's really pretty much, I guess, classroom's level of paint. But this is what the colors look like. You get a nice little selection, and it does come with this brush. It's not the best brush, but it does the job, I suppose, if you're in a classroom. Okay, and then I also have my high quality professional paints. These are tube paints that have been put into these wells. It's a plastic travel tray, and you can see the colors are similar as far as when they're dried and you compare them. They look similar, but they actually behave quite differently. But I will have both on hand, and we'll do a little test of each of these. The 6 along the bottom there, those are the Daniel Smith starter set colors, and I will list those if you're interested in those. Essentially, those come in a little starter set for a warm and cool of each of your primaries, and I did do a video on this in a deeper dive. If you're interested, I will go ahead and link that, and you can see how you can work with those colors and get a really nice color palette with just 6 colors. And if you're wondering what that hole is, that is just for your thumb, so that if you were to travel with this little set, you could hold it in one hand and paint with the other. And it's an easy way to take your paints, and it's portable. And in case you've never seen tube paints or you're new, this is what they look like. All you do is put a little bit from your tube into your well, and then you let it dry overnight, and then it's ready to go. and you can always reactivate paint with water. That's why you see on that palette I still have paint and I didn't wash it down, is because you can just wet it again with water and you can reactivate and reuse that paint, so it doesn't really get wasted. All right, so as a contrast to that student brush, I have my favorite brushes. These are a better quality, and they're not the most expensive, but they are really nice, and I do love them. And they're pretty standard price as far as the range of you can get in paintbrushes. So one is the Silver Black Velvet series, and the other is the Princeton Velvet Touch. Now, the difference between these brushes and others are that they are pointed round, and that means they come to a fine point at the end. And that will give you some really lovely details and nice line work. You can get round brushes that are not pointed, so that is something to keep in mind if you are looking to do very detailed light work as well as bigger washes. A pointed round paintbrush will give you far more options and versatility. Okay, and the other things you might want to keep on hand are a paper towel or two for blotting your paintbrush, and also a couple jars of water, one for rinsing cool colors and one for rinsing warm colors. I went ahead and cut down the papers and labeled each of them so that it's really easy to see them in real time which one we are working with at the moment. And so I just made little scraps since we don't need an entire sheet. All right, so starting with that student brush, I'm just getting it a little bit wet in that jar of water, and then you can see that the end of it is already starting to flop over. It just bends really easily, and it's just really, really soft. If your paintbrush is too floppy and it doesn't really hold its shape, you'll have a hard time making the types of strokes that you really want. It's harder to control when your paintbrush is so soft and just flops over like that. Okay, and then as a comparison, the other two brushes, which are the higher quality brushes, you'll notice that that really is not as soft on the top. Those bristles really bounce back, and so they hold their shape and they just snap right back into shape. And even that end stays as a fine point and it doesn't get splayed or lose its fine point. And I'm pushing pretty much as I did the other one, and it's still retaining that shape. That is a sign of a good quality brush. It's so much easier to control your paint and water when your brush snaps back and holds its shape and it doesn't just start fraying all over the place. Okay, so for the first step, I'm just going to get a little bit of this color on the palette that's already there. It's the green color from the Daniel Smith side of the paints. And what I'm doing is I'll make a test for a flat wash. So I'll make a leaf shape and I'll use the student brush first. And you can see some of that hair from that brush is already coming out. That can happen in a lower quality paintbrush because some of those hair and bristles are not as securely attached. All right, so I did the first two, and this is the Faber-Castell on the left and the Canson paper on the right. And you can see that I tried to get as even as a wash as possible, so not too much water, but there's a nice sheen across there. So we'll move forward and work on the professional paper as well. Same shape and same amount of water, all with that student brush. Okay, and here's the close-up of the professional papers. So it's got a flat wash with a nice sheen, not too much water and not too dry. So we'll see how this dries over time, and you can already see some of the edging on the lower quality paper. You can see on that student paper, some of that water is just pushing to the edges and you're getting a hard line. So it's already drying unevenly. All right, so switching brushes now and using same tube paints. These are the higher quality paints. I will do a little rose, just a little one, just an example to see how the paint does on each of these papers. If you're interested in how to make a rose more of a deep dive step by step, I do have a video on that. I will link it as well. This is just a quick little example to test out each of these papers, so I'm not going too much into the tutorial of this. But essentially I am using a more concentrated bit of color in the center and then getting lighter and more diluted as I move outward around with those petal shapes. Okay, and here's a close-up of these student papers, and you can see that there are a little bit of hard line edges already. And on the professional papers, I'm getting a more even wash on each of those strokes. Okay, so now switching paints. I'm using the student grade paint here, and I'll put a little bit of that paper underneath the lid so you can see the color because it's so clear. The color of that green is so bright, and you will find that in student grade paints. A lot of the pigment is super bright, and it's just how they make the paint. It's usually got some other fillers in there. But what you can do is sort of neutralize that color a little bit. I'm adding a little bit of orange, and so instead of that really limey bright green, it's a little bit more of a toned down green, more towards an olive. And I'm going to try to make a few leaves with this paintbrush, which is a student paintbrush, and it is hard to get those fine points with this brush, but I'm still going to try. And I'll do this little test on each of the papers as well, and then we'll take a look at them. You can also see pretty close up that this paint doesn't really sink into the paper. It's sort of gliding across the top and it's beading up a little bit. That's probably why all those harsh edges and hard lines are showing up. And then on the professional paper, the higher quality paper, you can see the even wash. Even though it's still hard to get a fine point on the actual shape, the paint itself is actually playing a lot nicer with the paper. All right, so we'll let this dry and then we'll come back and take a look. All right, so now that they have dried, let's take a look at all four of them up close and compare them. We have the two on the left, which are student grade, and then those other two on the right, which are the professional papers. You can really see that Canson one has just not done so well with an even wash or the evenness of those leaves. That paint and water is really just, it sat on top of the surface of the paper rather than sinking in and really blending. So even with that rose you can see, and surprisingly the Faber-Castell did better, even though that's a really thinner paper and the Canson is thicker paper. So I was surprised to see that. And on the Arches and the Winsor & Newton, you get a really nice even wash. There isn't that much of a difference. You could choose either of those and get a really nice result. Okay, so now our next test is going to be a wet on wet test. And I'm using the higher quality paintbrush for this. I'm still going to use the student paints on each of the papers though, and we'll see how they do. So wet on wet is what it sounds like. It's two areas that are water and paint, and they mix and meet together on the paper and blend on the paper together. So I'll put down one color on the left and another color on the right, and that two edges that are wet in the middle, they should blend up nicely together. All right, so for that first wet on wet, I did a circle of red and purple, and they're really similar colors. And even though they're pretty together, it was hard to really see if that color was mixing on its own. So now I'm going to be choosing two very different colors, a red and a blue. and we'll see if those wet on wet work together. So I'm doing a stroke this time of red and then just adding the blue along the side where I'm barely touching it on the right side, and where they meet in the middle they should mix and make some version of a purple. I feel like that Canson paper is just really not doing so great. I know a lot of people love Canson, and I know a lot of artists really swear by it and it works for them. For some reason, it's just never worked for me. I've had such a struggle trying to get the water and the paint to work correctly. And so you can even see with that red and blue, they don't really mix. The paint just sticks on its area. It just stays where I put it, and it doesn't really blend and mix up on its own. It's kind of gliding across the surface and it just stays there. Where on, for example, the other two, which are the higher quality, the Winsor Newton and the Arches, that color really soaks in and blends together really nicely. All right, so here's a close-up of all of them, and you can see that it's just really wet and not mixing. But on the Winsor Newton one, you can see that that color in the middle, that purple, is a nice blend of the red and blue. And then the one with the arches, it's a little bit similar, but it's also very even. So I think that's a really pretty combination. I prefer when my paper does things like this. It's even and the colors actually work really well together, and you can kind of have some really fun textures happening on purpose and not bad textures that you don't want. For example, on the student grade paper, they give you hard lines and edges and just don't play nicely. All right, so we'll let all four of these fully dry, and then we'll come back and we'll take a final look. All right, so everything has dried, and now I can do a little close-up of all of them. The Faber-Castell still is a little bit wet in the corner there on one of the paint swatches. The Canson is dry, but it dried really oddly. And the Winsor Newton did really well, and so did the Arches. I think you can tell which are my favorites. Even that subtle blend of the red and the purple are really pretty. Even those are even and flat. So I was really happy with those. And there's one final test, and that is a layering test, and that is for details and adding when you go to add shadows or lines and layering on top of your watercolors. So let's do that final test and then take a look. All right, so for this final test, I will use the higher quality brush since I'm using fine line work, and I will go ahead and use the student grade paint. And then we will add in some lines onto the leaves and see if I can add a little bit more of detail and definition. Okay, and now to do the detail test with the student brush, I'll go in and see if I can add a little bit more definition into that rose. So what I'm doing is putting a stronger color in the center, and then I'm rinsing my brush and softening out some of those edges. And we'll see how this looks on each of the papers. All right, so we'll let this layer dry on all of them, and then we'll come take a final look. Okay, final showdown time. Everything has dried, and let's take a closer look. This is a Faber-Castell sheet. And here is the Canson sheet. And here's a close-up of the Winsor Newton. And finally, close-up of the arches. Okay, so in my opinion, the professional paper just blew everything else out of the water. So between the two, I don't think you can go too wrong. They both had really good, nice, even washes and even drying time, and it was a lot easier to make the crisper marks and make the strokes do what I wanted them to do. And by comparison, looking at the student grade papers, they weren't too bad, but I would say between the two, I would choose Faber-Castell. I think that it actually was a little bit easier as far as water and paint control. The Canson was just really hard to control at all. And so that is something to keep in mind if you are between papers. And there's nothing wrong with student grade papers when you're starting out. You can do a lot of practicing on it, but it will be a lot more frustrating when you're trying to do some of the different techniques like wet on wet or glazing, for example. And when it comes to brushes, for sure, I think invest in some high quality brushes. You only need a couple in maybe like a small size or a medium size, anywhere from a 4 to a 6 for your smaller one, and maybe a 8 to a 10 for the larger one. If it's a pointed round brush, you can actually do almost everything with just those two brushes. So I would recommend that for brushes. And the good news is that paintbrushes aren't as expensive. As you get higher quality, you can find some really nice brushes that are decently priced. So you don't have to break the bank getting brushes. And then as far as paints, I would say that the student grade paints weren't that bad. They tend to run a little brighter. They have a lot of filler in them, so they're designed to be a bit more economical. But if you do want to invest in high quality tube paints, which I would recommend, that Daniel Smith starter set is really great for tube paints. You can also get pan sets of high quality paints. I have a whole list of what I would recommend for my students, and so if you're interested, I have that listed below. You can check that out. And as far as the hierarchy, so let's rate these. If you had to invest in one high quality supply between paints, brushes, and paper, this is the order I would go in. I would choose high quality paper first, and then invest in good brushes, and then third, get some paints between high quality and student level. I hope this was a fun little showdown and exercise. I hope that you learned something. And if you're just starting out, I hope it helped you make some decisions on your own supplies and where to invest in your watercolor journey. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.